So the Russian Revolution of 1917 is really actually the second revolution that Russia experiences in the 1900s. The first revolution that Russia has occurs in the early 1900s in 1904 and no, 1904-5, and that revolution is a revolution that actually occurs um, under the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. And the attempt here is to try and make Russia more democratic. So in 1904-5, the first revolution, the real thing to remember here is that they implement something called the Duma, D-U-M-A. The Duma is the first sort of representative democracy that Russia has, although it's not really, right? Russia at this time and up until 1917 is a country that is largely divided into very strict classes. One group at the top is called an oligarchy. The oligarchy is a group of people who own much of the land in Russia. They own much of the productive aspects, and they make up a very small percentage of the population, roughly 3 to 5%. But below them, the rest of the 95% are really just poor agrarian workers who work on the land owned by those oligarchic families. So the power really just rests in that top group. What happens then as a result is some people feel, particularly the lower classes, that not much has changed within the governing apparatus. Then you have a second revolution. By 1917, I hope you'll remember, World War I is well underway. The war has been going on since 1914, and Russia is not as industrially equipped as places such as Britain or Germany. And because they're not as industrially advanced, what happens as a result is you have massive amounts of manpower being thrown at the war. So where Russia doesn't have the technological output, Russia does have the man output. So Russia is basically just throwing men at the war. Now the problem is when you send all these people there, who are the ones fighting, right? It's not the oligarchic families, it's the poor people. So this creates and breeds more hostility, more tension, and by 1917, these tensions have flared up. So you have two revolutions. You have a 1904-5 revolution, then a 1917 revolution, and then just to make things even more confusing, the 1917 revolution has two parts to it too. So you have a March Revolution. The March Revolution is a revolution where this really is the first part where it gets rid of Tsar Nicholas II. So this revolution happens where the lower classes start to spontaneously strike against the industrial powers, and you have leadership in within the Duma, within the power structure, where these strikes are occurring. Not necessarily too much is said need to be said there. And what happens as a result then is on March 2nd, you have the Duma declaring a provisional government. Tsar Nicholas is forced to abdicate, and he is forced to go into exile. And he's actually sort of controlled by the different fighting forces for the next couple of years. Under this provisional government, they make a couple of big legal changes. And we're actually going to talk about those in a few moments. But what also happens is there's two groups that begin to emerge. You have the first one is a liberal, more moderate side that wants to see less of an overhaul and sort of complete change, and more sort of systematic legal changes, whereas the Petrograd Soviet group is a much more radical group. They really want to overthrow the whole system. And you have Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky as part of this. Now, Lenin, it's important to notice, Lenin is involved in the Soviet Union, and Lenin actually was in exile in Germany and then came back in the middle of the war, I should say, as an attempt, as a way to sort of start the revolution. I guess I should say the Germans have sort of the Germans and the Soviets, the Germans and the communist socialists have the same goal, which is cause unrest in Russia, right? The Germans want to do that because then it helps them win the war, gets Russia out of the war. But for the socialists, for the communists, it helps them because Russia's then distracted, right? So there you go. So the real important thing here to notice is that as a result of this provisional government, you have a growth in the two sides. And then as those two sides are fighting, what you then get out as the outcome is more and more hostility between the two. The royal family, the Tsar's family, is then sent throughout Russia, and you'll see a video on that. And then in the fall, there's a second revolution. The second revolution that occurs here is a revolution within the leading powers. So you have the Petrograd Soviet that gets more and more popular among the working classes. And ultimately, in the November Revolution, you have basically the overthrow of the provisional government. And as a result of that, you wind up getting more control being given to the to this more radical wing. They create a thing called the Council of People's Commissars that works on redistributing land. And the real important thing here is it starts to negotiate Russia's exit from World War I. Now, it's important to notice that Russia actually loses World War I, even though Russia had been part of the war effort for so long, and although Russia was ultimately on the winning side, Russia ultimately loses the war. Because they are forced to get rid of a lot of territory, and they're forced out of the war because of the revolution. So the communists now are in control of Russia, and this is really the beginning of the Soviet Union. However, there are people who are still loyal to the royal family, and they are still looking to support the royal family. And as a result of that, you have the beginning of a civil war. Now, the Civil War doesn't start until 1919, really. And this pits the whites and the reds versus one another. The whites are a group of people who support the royal family. The reds are obviously the people who support the socialist groups. Now, Lenin turns the whole government into a one-party system, and the whites are fighting against this, right? They do not want communism. They're people who are loyal to the bourgeoisie. And what you have as a result of that is Western governments actually supporting the white army, right? So you have the American government and the French government and the German government, the British government supporting the whites. Ultimately, Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin wind up leading this fight, and they wind up winning against the Petrograd Soviet, against the White Army. And this is really what settles the Soviet Union into its new form, right? That they are ultimately then able to start planning a Soviet country, a communist country. And one of the first things they start to do is they create the new economic policy. This is a economic policy, obviously, that works on a communist designs. The purpose of it was to 100% create a system where the Soviet Union would be able to manage the economy and control everyone's lives. And the purpose of this really is to get rid of capitalism within the Soviet Union. It's based on Marxist principles. We often call this Marxist-Leninist ideology. So Marx was, if you remember, or if you know, Marx was an economic historian. He was a philosopher, and a lot of his ideas had a lot of philosophical underpinnings. They were not necessarily very practical. Lenin, on the other hand, when he takes over, is he brings in the practicality of the Soviet Union. And what you get as a result is a more designed, more practical understanding, right? And I'm going to look at what that means in just a moment. So once the Soviet Union is declared with the November Revolution of 1917, laws began to start implementing those economic changes. So in 1918, there's a law passed called the Fundamental Law of Land Socialization. This law makes private property illegal. And it actually sets up a really interesting system by which people are going to have land divided up. So you'll see here, right, that all private property is abolished. The right to use land is not limited, right? One of the things that's really interesting about the Soviet Union in general, it has a lot of flaws. It's really, obviously becomes a terrible place to live. But Russian communism, whatever you want to call it, is actually very egalitarian. They establish a group created within the communist government to protect women's rights. Women have a right to ownership. And you'll actually see that down here. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that are not right about this, right? You have women counting for less than men. But it is important to notice that women are counted. Maybe not equally, certainly not equally, but they are counted nonetheless. And they are considered capable of work. They are given, Desitin is, you might want to think of it as analogous to an acre, although it's not the same. That's basically what it means, a division of land. And these are worker units, right? There is a system here of how a person can operate land. So it's important to see here that the Soviet government is very much looking at a way to divide up land, to give people equality, and so on. The Soviet Union also, as a policy, and this is a speech given by Vladimir Lenin earlier on, lays out the goal, right? The proletariat, the working class, is going to seize the power of the state. One of the other important things to notice about socialism and communism and Soviet communism is that the goal is to get rid of the government. The goal is to ultimately get rid of the state. And that's why Vladimir Lenin calls this the withering away of the state. The purpose of this is a violent revolution that ultimately gets rid of the power at the top and ultimately grows sort of an egalitarian, economically sound institution. Obviously, that's a pipe dream. It never can possibly happen. But it is important to see that that's what happens. Another piece of this, right, is there's sort of a condemnation of all the paths, right? Slave-owning citizenship, Middle Ages with feudal nobility, the bourgeoisie, right? Everything about these sort of oppressive groups. And this communism, socialism is a lot of us versus them mentality, that we, the workers, are fighting against them, the others. And that's an important thing to notice. And you'll be able to look at this, as the video is playing. But the proletarian statehood after the socialist revolution, right? There's this goal of class consciousness, class unification, and ultimately, again, getting rid of the state. You'll see here that there's also the mentioning of Marx and Engels, again, the writers of the Communist Manifesto. So the Russian Revolution, in many ways, is about the eradication of the bourgeoisie. Russia was perfectly primed for it. And World War I gave them the perfect explanation of why it would happen. So, thank you.